So, you want to buy a tennis string machine? Well, I think you've come to the right place. I've strung about 7,000 rackets amongst, I believe, 12 different types of string machines, and I want you guys to make the best possible decision. The machines that I've used have ranged anywhere from $150 to $7,000. Yeah, there's a huge range on that. The $150 string machine was slow, it was archaic, it had technology that cavemen could improve upon, and I didn't feel confident in the tension that it held by the time I was done with it, even though I did take my time. On the other end of the spectrum, the $7,000 string machine, which is the Wilson Bierdo, was an absolute dream to string with. It had a touchscreen, it had custom profiles, it could adjust its height on the fly, and even the angle at which the racket was resting could be changed at a touch of a button. It was awesome. It felt like it was coming out of the 22nd century. But here's a little bit of a spoiler. I don't want you guys to buy either of those two extremes for price points when it comes to buying a tennis string machine. If you want my recommendation on how to get a professional grade string machine that rivals those tennis shops that are appearing at Indian Wells, at Miami, and any of the other 4 Grand Slams and other major tournaments, I will leave a timestamp down in the description below if you want to skip ahead to that immediately. But if you guys want to stay along for the ride and understand the 3 main attributes that every tennis string machine has, stay along for the ride. You might be intimidated by some of these words and some of these terminologies that I'll be saying in this video, but that's what I'm here for. I'm going to break down the very basics of what to look for in a tennis string machine so you guys can get the most bang for your buck. And you guys can make the best informed decisions possible, because after all, you worked hard for your money. So each tennis string machine, and I'll say machine from now on for simplicity's sake, can be broken down into 3 main attributes. There's a tabletop versus the stand, the mounting system, and then lastly, the tensioner that is being used. I will also leave timestamps down in the description below if you guys want to skip to it. But in the meanwhile, let's get started. The first attribute to consider for a machine is, do you want to get a tabletop or do you want to get a standing machine? It's as simple as this. A tabletop machine needs to be placed on an elevated surface like a desk or some sort of kitchen table for you guys to operate the racket on. Obviously, a tabletop is going to be a lot cheaper than a standing machine, but at the cost of the level and height of which you string at, is predetermined by the surface that you place it on. So if you want to save $100 to $300 on a machine, yeah, go ahead, buy the tabletop. But if you want something more professional and if you want to save some table space, or if your apartment or house is already cramped to begin with, I would highly suggest dropping the $100 to $300 and getting a standing machine to save yourself some aches. The second thing to consider for a machine is the mounting system. Each machine that I've ever seen and I've ever used is either a 2-point mounting system or a 6-point mounting system. If you have seen any type of machine that is not either a 2 or a 6, leave a comment down in the section below, because I want to make fun of them, because that's just weird. I have never seen a 4, I've never seen an 8, so it's interesting to see if you guys have seen anything other than a 2 or a 6. The mounting system is the bracer of the tennis racket as you're pulling tension. If you have seen tennis stringers do their work, the racket actually does bend slightly every time you pull a main or every time you pull across. In fact, if you do something incorrectly, and that bend is extreme enough on one side, the racket will unfortunately break. And it's no surprise that for people out there, I would highly recommend you buy a 6-point mounting machine instead of a 2. Yes, it might be about $200 to maybe even $600 more expensive than a 2-point mounting system, but the safety that the 6-point mounting system can guarantee and the sheer amount of times I've heard of rackets breaking on a 2-point mounting system is well worth the investment. And for those of you that are a little bit more paranoid, you actually can get hurt, if not even get lethally injured, stringing a tennis racket if you're not careful enough. I have heard of stories where people shatter rackets accidentally because they weren't careful enough on a 2-point mounting system, where a piece of carbon that's embedded inside of the racket actually shot about 50 miles an hour and stuck to the drywall plaster. And imagine if there was a human being between the tennis racket and that wall that got hit. It's actually pretty scary. That's why it's important to be very, very careful about every tennis string you do and make sure there's no cracks before you even cut out the old strings. Long story short, buy a 6-point mounted machine. The last attribute to consider is the tensioner. The tensioner is the thing that surprisingly determines the actual tension on the string. This is the most important feeling for a tennis player when they strike a ball, except for possibly the knots. And if you want me to do a tutorial on the knots, please leave a comment down in the description below and I'll get to it if you guys are interested enough. And there are 3 types of tensioners out there. There's the drop weight, there's the crank, and then there is the electric. The drop weight relies on gravity to hold the tension as you're clamping it. This is fine for most people on a budget, but there might be some issues if you live in a very high or low altitude geographic location. Yes, it's really cheap. I would argue it's about $200 to $500 cheaper than the next level up of a tensioner, which is the crank, but it is very slow, it's very archaic, and even if you live on level land, it's not gonna be the most accurate. And it's slow enough to where it takes me about 40 minutes to string a racket with a drop weight versus 15 minutes to string a racket with a crank. The second type of tensioner to consider is the crank, and it relies on a spring-loaded mechanism to determine the tension. This is what most in-home machines use. Now, what's really great about this is it's still cheaper than an electric tensioner. It's about $300 to maybe even $1,000 cheaper than the next step up, which is the electric tensioner. And it's pretty damn solid. It has significantly fewer breakdowns than the electric tensioner because there's much fewer moving parts and it doesn't rely on electricity. And it has a lot better accurate tension maintenance than the drop weight, even if you do live near the sea level for the drop weight. And also, it's much, much, much quicker to string with a crank than a drop weight. Again, 40 minutes for me to string on a drop weight versus 15 on a crank. You're saving time if you're willing to invest the extra few $100s if your budget allows it. Now, the absolute chads of all tensioners for stringing machines. The electric tensioner uses a fairly complicated system to determine the tension. It is easily the most expensive out of the 3 types of tensioners. It is by far the most accurate. It also has the ability to do a constant tension pull. Unlike the crank, which just locks out as soon as it reaches the tension, it doesn't constantly pull the string, so if there's a minor shift in the racket angle that you're stringing it at after you lock it out, the tension won't be super accurate. Also, the electric tensioner has a pre-stretch option for those of you that use significantly softer strings or even natural gut. Although the time-saving difference isn't nearly as drastic as the drop weight to the crank, you will still save a few minutes per racket for an electric tensioner versus a crank. With a crank, it takes me about 15 minutes to string a racket, and under similar circumstances, I could string that exact same racket with the exact same string in about 13 minutes with an electric tensioner. And also, most electric tensioner strings have a quick profile access for your majority of tension needs for your clients. Be warned though, there are some cons other than price for the electric tensioner. If something breaks with this electric tensioner, you're pretty much unless you're an electrical engineering or mechanical engineering background, because the equipment and the parts inside of this electronic machine is extremely complicated. And also, if there's an electrical surge in your household, you're also pretty much because it's gonna fry the motherboard. And unless you have a warranty, you're gonna have to buy a new one. Here's my secret to spending under $1,000 and getting a quality machine that rivals those of the $7,000 commercial ones out there. Buy a slightly used 6-point mounting machine for about $400 to $500. The one I bought, which is the Gamma Progression 2, I bought off of a former student that was going to college and not playing college tennis, and it was, I think, $350 or $400. So if I were you guys, start networking or use Craigslist or Facebook Marketplace to scrap up a good deal on a slightly used tennis string machine. And then after you get used to stringing with a crank, go online and buy the Wise 2086 tension head electric tensioner or something similar to it. This video is not sponsored in any way. It is about $600 and it took about 25 minutes to install for me. So after that, you have everything you need. You have a standing string machine with a 6-point mounting system and an electric tensioner, and you've spent theoretically under $1,000. So for those of you that were thinking about buying something as extreme as a Wilson Bierdo, congrats, I've saved you about $6,000 and you now have an awesome string machine in your own home. However, there is one attribute that I left out for high quality string jobs. It's you, the stringer. You could have the most expensive and robust tennis string machine on the market, but if you don't have the experience and if you don't have the knowledge to use it well, it's practically useless. The most experienced tennis stringers out there can do a better job stringing on a $150 machine versus a novice stringing on a $7,000 one. So don't leave that attribute out of this equation. Practice. Practice often and practice well. I would argue that the machine itself is only 25% of how well a racket is strung. The other 75% is the person operating that machine and the person operating on that tennis racket with the strings. If you want me to do videos on how to weave crosses super quickly, how to weave the best knots, and overall give you advice on the do's and don'ts of a professionally strung tennis racket so you can show off to your friends and your loved ones, please let me know by hitting like, leaving a comment down in the section below, and consider hitting subscribe for more original tennis content like this. I also do tennis string reviews on a weekly basis on top of match play on this channel. I also do live streams while stringing tennis rackets and answering any questions you guys have Tuesdays and Thursdays at 7 p.m. Central Time. So I'll see you guys there. And as always, happy hitting.